Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Chair, I want to refer to clauses, particularly clauses 24 and 25 in respect of appeal rights, and particularly 24(3), and revisiting some of the arguments that the previous two speakers have noted. I want to note the comments that the Minister made in respect to former Environment Court Judge Skelton. He quite rightly pointed out that Judge or Justice Skelton is one of New Zealand's preeminent environmental justices, a man with huge skill and a history in these particular issues. And then, on the other hand, was silent or tried to justify, I can't quite recall which, the taking away of appeal rights to the specialist and highly skilled Environment Court, which, as others have said, is far more, it was highly qualified, far more qualified, I'd argue, than the High Court, has a process which is inquisitorial rather than, and far less prescriptive than the High Court, where you can deal with substantive issues and not just appeal on matters of law. So again, we see a sort of, an inherent contradiction. On the one hand, he acknowledges that he wants people, this is the Minister, people of skill in the form of Justice Skelton, and I accept that, and he justifies that because he wants people who know what they are doing. He wants people who are embedded, have a history of influence, who are, in Justice Skelton's place, an eminent jurist in respect of environmental matters. But of course then says, well, if you want to appeal, sorry, we're not going to allow you to appeal like every other person can outside the ECAN boundaries around New Zealand to the specialist court and jurisdiction, the Environment Court. No, you will only, or the parties will only be able to appeal to the High Court, and those appeals will only be on points of law. So the question I have for Minister Nick Smith is, what is the justification for that? And like other questions we've put to the Minister in respect of the extension to 2019 and the justification for that, there has been no answer to it. So on the one hand, you want specialists, quite logical, specialist people, experienced people, people with the inherent legal skills that you require to make decisions on these issues. And on the other hand, you say, no, we're not going to allow parties to be exposed to the court of record, the specialist environmental court that has been set up for many, many years specifically to deal with those issues. Now, I grant you, I'm sure there are a number of High Court judges who, or all High Court judges, I'm sure, would argue that they can decide matters across any jurisdiction. That is the function of a High Court judge. However, you'd have to argue that issues of a technical nature, that are of a specific environmental nature, should reside within the Environment Court. Otherwise, why have it? Why bother? Get rid of it and just ensure the court of record is the High Court to deal with all issues, technical and otherwise. They could do that, but I don't think that would be logical. So the question for the Minister is why is there a contradiction? What is the justification for limiting appeals, or for preventing appeals, I should say, going to the Environment Court and requiring them to go to the High Court, as in 24(3), what's the point? I would argue, just like the constriction around democracy, this is about control. Just like the notion that Canterburyans cannot be trusted to elect good leadership from within their community without being babysat by commissioners, that this is about control. This is about control and limiting the rights of people, both in a democratic sense, but as other speakers have said, in respect to access to justice. And they're pretty heavy actions to take as a government. We could make reference to other jurisdictions, well, as has been referenced actually by the Minister, quite bizarrely, his reference to Sitiveni Rambuka and the Fiji coup in a former speech in the last hour or so. In other jurisdictions that don't value democracy as we in this Parliament in New Zealand do, those jurisdictions, Mr Chair,
The Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
those jurisdictions are more likely to embark down these sorts of paths where you halt elections, where you appoint government folk who are not accountable to those people who elect them. They're accountable to ministers in a government, and you restrict the ability of people to exercise their legal rights, and more especially their appeal rights. Now, the Minister, in answer to some of those questions, especially around the issues that I've posed, cited DHBs and said, well, you know, the usual sort of stuff, you know, Labor sacked the DHB of X, Y and Z, you know, how can we get up and have the views we do? Well, there are times in government where you do actually have to sack some people if they're not actually performing. We would acknowledge that. That is a logical thing to do. But in respect of the DHBs, there's a couple of differences. The first is that those DHBs were then rapidly reinstated. Same, the Minister mentioned in his speech, the sacking of school boards where one puts a commissioner. But again, unlike this piece of legislation, those school boards, as a general rule, are pretty rapidly, once the situation is stabilised, converted back to elected boards of trustees. The third point in respect of DHBs and school boards, but especially DHBs, is they derive their income directly from the government, the taxpayer via the Crown. They are totally Crown funded. Totally Crown funded. Whereas ECAN, of course, apart from some transport funding and others, derives the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of its funding from the local ratepayer. That's the difference. You know the old saying, no taxation without representation. Bit of a cliche, but it's probably apt in this debate today. So, and I'm surprised that the Minister, again, as I've said in other speeches, holds the view that he does, and actually his view where he said democracy, quote unquote, is risky, at least he's been honest about that, because as we go through these parts, and specifically this part about constricting and preventing the rights to take appeals to the Environment Court and restricting them to the High Court, that actually provides evidence that he was telling the truth when he said, quote unquote, democracy is risky. And I'd put it to, there's a few foreign affairs specialists over there, that those are the sorts of attitudes and those are the sort of actions one would expect from some third world jurisdictions, not from a first world country called New Zealand. But the Minister believes it. And it's, you know, it's probably the most honest statement he's made, and these actions actually provide evidence that he believes this. So I'd like to ask perhaps the Minister and the Chair, even though it's not her portfolio, if she could shed some light on the contradictions that I've pointed out in respect of the High Court and the Environment Court. I think we would, I think the people of Canterbury are owed some specific explanations, not just a lot of cliches and a lot of lip service. They've lived with this for 9 years. Jerry Brownlee's seen the light, given Cantabrians back a lot of power in respect to the earthquake. Yet a week later we have this, which is pretty heavy-duty draconian legislation. The Minister sort of gives various commitments. He gave commitments in 2013 and he broke his word. So we wait with bated breath.
I regret interrupting the member, but the time has come for the dinner adjournment. We'll resume the chair at 7:30.
I couldn't give a speech.